Sometimes, true heroism doesn't come from those we expect. It comes from the hearts of those who choose to act, even when it's dangerous. The sky above the park is alive with color, vibrant kites soaring against the backdrop of the bright afternoon sun. Laughter and cheers fill the air as children run across the open field, their eyes locked on their kites, chasing the wind with uncontainable joy. Among them is Jamal, his heart pounding with excitement as he tugs on the string of his bright red and yellow kite, watching it dance effortlessly through the sky. This is his favorite place, his favorite moment, a carefree afternoon where nothing else matters. The world feels light, and for once there's no pressure, no expectations, just the simple joy of watching his kite glide with the wind. He runs forward, letting out more string, grinning as his kite catches an unexpected gust and soars even higher. His laughter joins the chorus of happy voices around him. The festival is in full swing, with families sprawled on picnic blankets, vendors selling cotton candy, and the occasional burst of applause when a particularly impressive kite maneuver is performed. Then, a piercing cry shatters the moment. Jamal's head snaps toward the sound, his heart skipping a beat. Across the field, near the edge of the park, he sees a boy struggling, a white boy about his age, tangled in a mess of kite strings. The wind has whipped the strings tight around his arms, the thin lines digging into his skin, cutting deep enough for small trickles of blood to appear. The boy flails desperately, his cries growing louder, but no one seems to react quickly enough. Some adults turn their heads, concerned but hesitant, as if unsure whether to intervene or wait for someone else to. Others are simply too caught up in the festival to notice, but Jamal sees, and without a second thought, he runs. His kite, forgotten, falls from the sky as he sprints toward the struggling boy, his feet pounding against the grass. His breath comes in short bursts, but his mind is focused. There is no hesitation, no fear, only the instinct to help. As he reaches the boy, Jamal sees the full extent of the problem. The wind has twisted the strings into a mess of sharp, tangled knots, tightening around the boy's arms and chest. Every time he moves, the strings cut deeper, his skin turning red with scratches and small cuts. His face is streaked with tears, his blue eyes wide with panic. Jamal kneels beside him, his own hands shaking as he quickly assesses the situation. The knots are too tight to pull apart easily, and the more the boy thrashes, the worse it gets. "Hey," Jamal says, his voice calm despite his racing heart. "Stop moving, okay? I'm going to help you." The boy sniffles, his breathing uneven. It hurts." "I know," Jamal nods, reaching for the tangled mess of strings. "Just hold still." With careful fingers, he starts working on the knots, ignoring the sting when the strings slice against his own skin. The wind fights against him, whipping the strings around, making it harder to loosen them. Jamal grits his teeth, refusing to give up. The boy's sobs quiet just a little as he watches Jamal work. The festival around them continues, but in this small moment, nothing else exists except for the determination in Jamal's hands and the trust forming between the two boys. Jamal has never been the kind of kid to stand by and do nothing. Growing up in a neighborhood where help wasn't always guaranteed, he learned early on that kindness wasn't something you waited for. It was something you gave. His mother always said, "If you see someone struggling, don't look away. Do what you can, even if it's small." And Jamal listened. He carried groceries for his elderly neighbors, helped his younger cousins with their homework, and shared what little he had with kids who had even less. His life hadn't been easy. His family didn't have much money, and there were days when his mother worked late shifts just to keep food on the table. But Jamal never let his struggles make him bitter. He had learned to adapt, to make the most of what he had, and to find happiness in the little things, like flying his kite. The annual Kite Festival was one of his favorite days of the year. It was the one time when everyone, no matter where they were from or how much money they had, gathered in the same place, just to enjoy the simple pleasure of watching kites dance in the sky. Families picnicked under the shade of tall oak trees. Kids ran through the open field with ribbons trailing behind them, and vendors lined the sidewalks, selling everything from fresh lemonade to bright cotton candy. Jamal had saved up for weeks to buy his kite, a red and yellow one with a long, flowing tail. It wasn't the biggest or the fanciest, but it was his, and that was all that mattered. As the wind carried it higher, he felt lighter, freer, as if, for a few moments, he could forget about all the hardships waiting for him at home. A few feet away, in a completely different world, another boy was enjoying the festival in a very different way. This boy, Ethan, was the kind of kid who had never wanted for anything. His family was well off, living in a house with more rooms than they needed, where dinner was always served hot, and weekends were filled with trips and expensive toys. He didn't know what it was like to go to bed hungry or to worry about bills. His problems were smaller, simpler, things like whether he got the latest video game or if his parents would let him stay up late. Ethan's kite was huge, custom-made, with a sleek design that made it look more like a professional stunt kite than something a kid would fly for fun. His parents had bought it for him without a second thought. Just another item in a long list of things they provided, without question. He had never really stopped to consider how lucky he was. But in the moment when the wind turned against him, sending his kite spiraling out of control, none of that mattered. The strings wrapped around his arms before he even had time to react. One moment he was flying his kite, laughing with his friends, and the next he was trapped. His own kite, now his worst enemy. The more he struggled, the tighter the strings pulled, cutting into his skin, leaving sharp, stinging marks. Panic set in as he tried to free himself, but it was no use. His parents were nowhere in sight, lost in the crowd. People turned their heads at the sound of his cries, but no one moved fast enough to help. Maybe they assumed someone else would step in. Maybe they were too caught up in their own fun. And then there was Jamal. He saw the fear in Ethan's eyes, the way his body jerked in distress as the strings dug deeper. The festival, the fun, the kites in the sky, all of it faded. Jamal didn't see a rich kid. He didn't see someone from a different world. He just saw another boy who needed help. Without hesitation, Jamal ran. His kite, his fun, his carefree afternoon, none of it mattered anymore. The only thing that mattered was getting to Ethan before the strings tightened further, before the cuts became something worse, before he was hurt in a way that couldn't be undone. As he reached Ethan, dropping to his knees beside him, their eyes met for the first time. Jamal didn't know Ethan's life, and Ethan didn't know Jamal's. But in that moment, none of that mattered. There was no rich and poor, no privilege and struggle, no differences that kept them apart. There were only two boys in a park, one trapped and scared, the other determined to set him free. And for the first time, Ethan, who had spent his life surrounded by people who had everything, realized what it truly meant to need someone. And for the first time, Jamal, who had spent his life giving to others without expecting anything in return, knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The world around Jamal blurred into a rush of colors and sound, but he focused only on one thing: freeing the boy before it was too late. The festival continued in the background, kites still soaring in the sky, children laughing in the distance, families enjoying their afternoon, unaware that just a few feet away, a boy was fighting against something as thin as air, but as dangerous as a blade. Jamal's feet pounded against the soft grass as he sprinted toward the tangled mess of kite strings, his breath shallow but steady. The boy's cries had turned to desperate gasps, his arms pulling helplessly against the tight coils, digging into his skin. His once pristine white shirt was now streaked with red, small cuts forming where the strings had sliced through. His chest heaved with panic, eyes darting around as if searching for someone, anyone, to save him. No one moved. The crowd stood frozen, some gripping their kites, others with hands over their mouths in horror. Adults exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of what to do. The fear in their eyes was clear. They didn't want to make it worse. They didn't know how to help. But Jamal did. As he dropped to his knees beside the boy, he immediately assessed the situation. The strings were tangled in multiple loops around his arms, chest, and, worst of all, his neck. The more the boy struggled, the deeper the thin lines cut, leaving angry red welts against his pale skin. Jamal reached into his pocket and pulled out the small pocket knife he carried, a gift from his grandfather, who always told him, "A man should be ready to help, even when no one else is." His hands were steady, despite the urgency. He had never been in a situation like this before, but there was no time for hesitation. "I'm gonna cut the strings, okay?" Jamal said quickly, his voice firm but calm. "Just don't move too much." The boy whimpered but nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. Jamal flipped the knife open and began cutting. The strings, as thin as they were, fought back. Some were wound so tightly that he had to carefully work the blade underneath without accidentally cutting the boy's skin. His hands shook slightly from the tension, but he didn't let the fear slow him down. Slice. One loop came free. The boy let out a sharp gasp as his arm was released, but there was no time to stop. More strings were still wrapped around him like a constricting snake. Jamal worked quickly, cutting through the layers, careful not to pull too hard. The boy winced as another sharp piece of string snapped back, leaving another thin cut. "Almost there," Jamal reassured him, his own fingers now bleeding from handling the sharp strings. The last coil around the boy's neck was the hardest. It was so tight that any sudden movement could cut deeper, and Jamal knew he had to be extra careful. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before sliding the blade beneath the final string. The boy's breath hitched as he felt the pressure against his throat, but he held still. One slow, deliberate cut. The string snapped free. The boy stumbled backward, gasping for air, his hands flying to his throat as if to confirm that he could breathe. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his legs shaking beneath him. Jamal exhaled, his own body finally releasing the tension he had held. He flicked the knife closed and tucked it back into his pocket, barely noticing the sting of his scraped hands. The crowd, which had been eerily silent, suddenly erupted into murmurs. People exchanged looks of disbelief, pointing at Jamal, shaking their heads as if unable to process what had just happened. He had done what no one else had. The boy, still catching his breath, turned his wide, stunned eyes toward Jamal. For a moment he just stared, as if trying to understand why this boy, this complete stranger, had risked so much to help him. "You," the boy started, his voice hoarse. "You saved me." Jamal just nodded, wiping his hands on his jeans. Yeah. More people moved closer now. A woman rushed forward, likely the boy's mother, her face pale with panic as she wrapped her arms around him, checking his injuries, brushing his hair back in frantic concern. But even as she fussed over him, her eyes flickered toward Jamal, filled with something more than just gratitude. There was something else there, something deeper. Recognition. Jamal had been just another kid at the festival, another face in the crowd. But now they saw him. The boy swallowed hard, still shaken, but his expression softened. "Thank you," he whispered. Jamal gave him a small, tired smile. "No problem." The festival continued around them, the sky still dotted with dancing kites. But for those who had witnessed what happened, something had changed. The day was no longer just about fun and games. It was about bravery, about stepping up when no one else would, about breaking through the invisible barriers that separated people. Jamal didn't wait for applause. He didn't need it. He had done what was right. And that was enough. The wail of sirens filled the air, cutting through the hum of the festival as paramedics rushed onto the field. The white boy, still shaken but no longer in immediate danger, was gently lifted onto a stretcher as his mother hovered over him, fussing with his hair, kissing his forehead, whispering reassurances. The crowd slowly began to disperse, conversations buzzing about what they had just witnessed, about the boy who saved another. Jamal stood back, his hands still stinging from where the sharp kite strings had sliced through his skin. He didn't expect anything. He never did. Helping others had never been about recognition for him. It was simply what he had been raised to do. His mother had always told him, "Do what's right, even if no one's watching." And that's exactly what he had done. Then the boy's father arrived. A man in an expensive suit, looking every bit as important as the wealth he carried, hurried onto the scene. His eyes immediately locked onto his son, concern etched into every feature. "Ethan," he called, rushing forward, pushing past the crowd without hesitation. "Are you okay?" The boy, still dazed, nodded weakly. "Yeah, Dad, I'm okay." His father let out a breath of relief, his shoulders dropping as he placed a firm hand on Ethan's head. "You scared the life out of me." Then Ethan lifted his hand and pointed, straight at Jamal. "He saved me," he said simply. The businessman's gaze followed his son's outstretched hand, landing on the boy standing off to the side, still wiping his scraped hands on his jeans. In a split second, one small act of bravery can change everything. For Malik, a young black boy, his heroic actions would not only save a life, but challenge the deep-seated prejudices of those who least expected it. The afternoon sun casts a golden glow over the neighborhood, washing the streets in warm light. Laughter drifts through the air as children ride their bikes, play hopscotch, and chase each other in games that seem to have no end. The world feels light, peaceful. For Malik, this is one of those rare, perfect afternoons, where the air is just right, the breeze cool against his skin, and time moves a little slower. He kicks a small stone down the sidewalk, his hands tucked into the pockets of his oversized hoodie. There is no rush to be anywhere, no reason to worry about anything. Today is a good day. And then he hears it, a cry. Faint at first, but enough to make him pause. He tilts his head, listening. It's not the cry of an upset child throwing a tantrum or one calling for a parent nearby. No, this is different. It is panicked, desperate. Malik's chest tightens. He looks around, scanning the quiet street. No one else seems to notice. The kids are still playing. The cars drive by without slowing, and the world continues as if nothing is wrong. But something is wrong. The sound is coming from an open window in the apartment building just across the street. He can't see inside, but the cries grow louder, more frantic. His heart starts to race. Someone, a baby, is in trouble. He moves without thinking, crossing the street quickly. His sneakers barely make a sound against the pavement as he nears the apartment's front door. It's slightly ajar. His gut twists. Something isn't right. He pushes the door open gently, stepping inside. The hallway is dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old carpet and something faintly burnt, like someone forgot to turn off the stove. The baby's cries are coming from the kitchen. Malik follows the sound, his breath catching the moment he steps inside. A toddler, barely old enough to walk, is sitting on the floor, reaching toward the counter where a knife block teeters dangerously at the edge. One more pull, one more inch closer, and one of those sharp blades could come crashing down. The child is completely unaware. Malik freezes, every muscle in his body locking up. One wrong move, one sudden noise, and the baby could startle, tipping the block over. His mind races. He has to act. Carefully, he takes a slow step forward, his hands steady, but his heart pounding. He knows this moment could change everything. Malik had always been the kind of kid who noticed things that others didn't. Growing up in a modest home, he had learned early on that kindness was free, and that helping others wasn't about what you had. It was about who you were. His mother, a woman of quiet strength, always reminded him, the world may not always be fair, but that doesn't mean you stop being good. And Malik took those words to heart. In his neighborhood, he was known for small acts of kindness. He carried groceries for elderly neighbors, helped younger kids learn to ride their bikes, and always looked out for his friends. He didn't do it for recognition. Most of the time, people barely noticed him. And when they did, it wasn't always in the way he deserved. Despite his bright smile and good heart, Malik was often met with wary glances from strangers, especially in the wealthier parts of town. People locked their car doors when he walked by. Store owners watched him a little too closely when he browsed their shelves. Some parents pulled their children away from him, as if his very presence was a threat. He had never done anything wrong. But to some people, the way he looked, the color of his skin, the way his clothes weren't new, the fact that he didn't come from money, was enough to make them judge him. He was used to it. But that didn't mean it didn't sting. That day, when he had been playing outside, soaking in the rare freedom of a peaceful afternoon, he hadn't thought about any of that. He had just been a kid, enjoying the moment. But life had a way of reminding him that the world wasn't always fair. And he was about to be reminded of that again. The baby's mother, Claire Whitmore, was everything Malik was not. She lived in an upscale apartment, the kind with shiny floors and expensive furniture that no one actually sat on. She came from a family where money was never a concern, where problems could be solved with a phone call or a check. To her, struggle was an abstract concept, something she had only seen in movies. Her days were filled with coffee dates, social media scrolling, and casually expensive shopping trips. She was always busy, but never in the way Malik's mother was. While his mom worked long hours just to keep food on the table, Claire spent her time attending charity galas, where she never actually spoke to the people she was supposedly helping. She wasn't a bad person, just oblivious. She had never had to see the world through any lens but her own, and because of that, she had never seen kids like Malik. When she returned home that day, stepping into her apartment with her phone pressed to her ear, she didn't immediately notice the way the door had been left ajar. She didn't hear the soft sounds of someone moving in the kitchen. She was too caught up in a conversation, complaining about how difficult it was to find good childcare, about how exhausting it was to balance her social life with being a mother. And then she saw him, a boy, black, dressed in clothes that weren't designer, standing in her kitchen. For a split second, her world stopped. Her first thought wasn't, "Why is there a child in my home?" Or "Is my baby safe?" It was, "Am I being robbed?" Fear shot through her veins. Her phone slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. The moment Malik saw the baby reaching for the knife block, everything else in the world faded away. The toddler, unaware of the danger, continued crawling forward, tiny fingers stretching toward the smooth, shiny handle of a kitchen knife teetering at the edge of the counter. One small tug, one wrong move, and the blade would come crashing down. Malik didn't think. He moved. In a split second, he lunged forward, his sneakers skidding slightly on the tiled floor. He reached out, his hands scooping up the baby just as their tiny hand brushed against the knife handle. The sudden shift of weight caused the block to tilt dangerously, but Malik twisted his body, pulling the child away just in time. The knife clattered to the ground, the sharp blade reflecting the overhead light. For a moment, there was silence. The baby, startled by the movement, blinked up at Malik in confusion. Then, as if sensing that he was safe, he giggled, small hands grabbing onto Malik's shirt, completely unaware of how close he had come to disaster. Malik let out a shaky breath. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He held the child close, his hands trembling slightly, as the weight of what had just happened sank in. Then footsteps, fast, rushed. The baby's mother burst into the room, her heels clicking against the floor, her face pale with panic. "Oh my God!" she gasped, her eyes darting between Malik and her child. What happened?" Malik turned, still holding the baby, his voice steady despite the rush of emotions in his chest. "He was crawling toward the knives," he said simply. "I grabbed him before he got hurt." Claire's eyes widened. She glanced at the knife on the floor, then back at her baby, safe, unharmed, smiling. The reality of what could have happened settled in, and her breath hitched. Tears filled her eyes. She stepped forward, hands outstretched, as Malik gently handed the baby back to her. She cradled him against her chest, pressing frantic kisses to his forehead, her shoulders shaking with relief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. Then, louder, with more urgency, she looked at Malik, her expression raw with emotion. "Thank you. You saved my baby." Malik nodded, shifting his weight slightly. He wasn't used to this much attention. "It's okay," he said. I did what anyone would do." Claire shook her head. "No," she said, her grip on her child tightening. "You don't understand. If you hadn't been here—" Her voice broke. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment before exhaling deeply. "I don't even want to think about what could have happened." The room, which had once felt so heavy with danger, was now thick with emotion. And then, just as quickly as the gratitude came, something shifted. Claire pulled back slightly, studying Malik with new eyes. She took in his appearance, his dark skin, his simple clothes, the small scrapes on his hands. Her expression, once filled with pure relief, changed. A flicker of something else passed across her face, something hesitant, something prejudiced. And then she said it. "I never thought someone like you would care enough to help." The words, though quiet, cut through the room like a knife sharper than the one that had nearly fallen. Malik's stomach twisted. He had heard words like that before, not always as direct. Sometimes it was a look, sometimes it was a tone, but it always meant the same thing. People like him, kids from his neighborhood, kids with skin like his, weren't supposed to be the heroes. Claire's words lingered in the air, thick and heavy with meaning. The room, which had just moments ago been filled with relief, now carried the weight of something far uglier. Malik could have let it slide, could have pretended he didn't hear it. But he was tired of pretending, so instead he met her gaze, his voice calm but firm. I was just doing what anyone would do. The simplicity of his response made the moment even heavier. Claire flinched. She opened her mouth as if to say something, to explain, to backtrack, but no words came, because there was no excuse. From the doorway, a few neighbors who had gathered to see the commotion exchanged glances. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked ashamed. They had all seen Malik around before. Some had dismissed him. Some had judged him without knowing him. But today they saw him differently. A few people murmured softly. One man shook his head, his gaze lingering on Claire as if to ask, "Did you really just say that?" Malik didn't wait for an apology. He didn't need one. He had done what was right. That was enough. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. And this time, when people looked at him, they didn't just see a boy from the neighborhood. They saw a hero. Claire sat in her living room, the weight of her words pressing down on her chest like a boulder. The afternoon sun poured in through the large windows, but it did nothing to warm the cold pit forming in her stomach. She replayed the moment over and over again, the look in Malik's eyes, the quiet but firm way he had responded, and the way the air in the room had shifted as soon as she had spoken. "I never thought someone like you would care enough to help." She had said it. Without thinking, without pausing to consider how it would sound, without realizing the full weight of what she was implying. Now, in the silence of her home, with her baby peacefully asleep in his crib, the gravity of her mistake crashed over her like a tidal wave. Malik had saved her child, not because he wanted anything in return, not because he had to, but because he was the kind of person who didn't hesitate when someone was in danger. And yet, when she had looked at him, she hadn't seen a hero. She had seen his skin, his clothes, the things society had taught her to notice first. And because of that, she had hurt him. Claire's hands trembled as she pressed them together, trying to make sense of the feelings twisting inside her. She had never thought of herself as prejudiced. She gave to charities. She attended diversity events. She had friends from different backgrounds. But today, she had exposed a truth about herself that she could no longer ignore. She had judged Malik before she knew his heart. And that truth made her feel sick. The next morning, Claire stood outside a modest apartment complex, her fingers gripping the strap of her purse as she took a deep breath. She had spent hours debating whether she should come, whether an apology would even matter. But she knew that this wasn't about her guilt. This was about making things right. She knocked softly on the door, her heart pounding. A moment later, the door opened, and she was met with the warm but cautious eyes of a woman, Malik's mother. "Mrs. Whitmore." The woman's voice was polite, but held an edge of uncertainty. Claire nodded quickly. "Yes, I—" She swallowed, the words suddenly hard to form. "I wanted to speak to you, and to Malik." The woman studied her for a moment before stepping aside, allowing her in. The apartment was small but cozy, filled with signs of a loving home, family photos on the walls, the faint smell of something warm cooking in the kitchen. Malik sat on the couch, his expression unreadable as he looked up at her. He had no reason to welcome her here. He had every right to hold on to the sting of her words. But he simply waited, giving her the chance to say what she had come to say. Claire took a shaky breath. "Malik," she started, her voice softer than it had been the day before. "I came here because I need to apologize." Malik's mother glanced at her son, waiting. Claire continued, her hands twisting in front of her. "Yesterday, after everything you did to save my child, I said something that was—" She paused, struggling to find the right word, but there was no way to soften it. "Hurtful, wrong, and I need you to know that I regret it." Malik remained quiet, his expression neutral, but she could see the way his hands were folded tightly together. "I was raised in a world where people like me make assumptions about people like you without even realizing it," Claire admitted, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "And that's not an excuse. It's a problem, one that I should have confronted a long time ago. But yesterday, you made me realize just how blind I've been." Malik's mother nodded slightly, her lips pressed together, waiting for Claire to continue. Claire looked back at Malik. "I don't want my son growing up with those same blind spots. I don't want him to see the world through the lens of prejudice the way I have. And I know that words aren't enough to fix what I said, but I want you to know that I see you for who you are. A hero. A young man with more kindness and courage than most adults I know." For the first time since she arrived, Malik's expression shifted. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but something in his eyes softened. Claire inhaled deeply. "I also wanted to do something else. I don't want what you did to be forgotten or ignored. You deserve recognition for your bravery." She turned to Malik's mother. "I've spoken with some people in the community, and I want to make sure Malik's story is told. People need to know what kind of young man he is." Malik's mother studied her carefully before speaking. "You don't need to do that to make up for what you said." "I know," Claire replied quickly. "And this isn't about making myself feel better. It's about making sure that the world sees Malik the way he deserves to be seen." A silence stretched between them before Malik's mother finally nodded. Malik, still watching her, finally spoke. "I didn't help your baby because I wanted to thank you," he said quietly. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." Claire nodded, her throat tightening. "And that's why it matters so much." For the first time since she had walked in, Malik gave her a small nod in return. It wasn't full forgiveness. That would take time. But it was a start. And for Claire, it was the first step toward breaking the cycle she had been trapped in for far too long. The days following the incident were unlike anything Malik had ever experienced. People in the neighborhood who had once overlooked him now saw him in a new light. Strangers who barely acknowledged his presence before now greeted him with nods of respect. The same store owners who had once watched him with suspicion now smiled when he walked in, their wary eyes replaced with something different, something closer to admiration. For the first time in his life, Malik wasn't just there, he was seen. It wasn't the kind of attention he had sought. He had never done anything expecting recognition. But knowing that people were beginning to see him for who he really was, rather than the assumptions they had made about him before, felt like a quiet victory. Claire Whitmore's apology had been sincere. And though Malik wasn't the type to hold grudges, he had needed time to process it. He had spent his whole life navigating a world that treated him differently because of his skin, his background, and where he lived. Change didn't come overnight. But something about the way Claire had looked at him that day, the way her voice had trembled when she admitted her mistake, made him believe that maybe, just maybe, she was different now, and she wasn't the only one. The story of what happened in her apartment spread beyond their small community. Parents who had once lectured their children to stay away from trouble found themselves using Malik's name in a different kind of conversation. He wasn't a cautionary tale. He was an example of courage. Teachers at school spoke about his quick thinking, and even the local news picked up the story, highlighting the 10-year-old boy who had saved a life without hesitation. Malik's mother, who had spent years shielding her son from the cruelty of the world, watched as people finally began to recognize what she had always known. Her son was remarkable. And yet, despite all the attention, Malik remained the same. He still helped his neighbors. He still played outside with his friends. He still held the same kindness in his heart that he always had. But something inside him had changed, not because of how others saw him, but because of how he now saw himself. For so long, he had been made to feel small, like his presence was something to be tolerated rather than valued. But now, he understood something powerful. His actions mattered. His kindness had made a difference. And if it could change the way people saw him, maybe it could change the way people saw others like him, too. His relationship with Claire and her family began to evolve in ways he hadn't expected. She had gone from being just another face in the neighborhood to someone who genuinely wanted to learn, to do better. She invited Malik and his mother over for dinner, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine desire to bridge the gap between them. She asked questions, she listened, she learned. And Malik? He gave her grace, because while he had every right to hold on to resentment, he chose something else instead. Hope. Hope that if one person could change, maybe others could too. That hope wasn't just felt in Claire's home. It rippled through the entire community. People began to have uncomfortable but necessary conversations about the biases they had carried for years. They reflected on the ways they had judged people, like Malik, without ever giving them a chance. Parents started teaching their children not just to be kind, but to be aware, to recognize when prejudice shaped their views and to challenge it, rather than accept it as normal. Even institutions, places where inequality had once been quietly accepted, began to take notice. Schools looked at the way they treated students differently based on where they came from. Local businesses re-examined how they interacted with their customers. A shift had begun, not a massive revolution, but a series of small, important changes sparked by the courage of one young boy. Malik never set out to change the world. He had simply done what was right. But sometimes that's all it takes. A single act of kindness, a moment of bravery, a decision to help even when no one expects you to. Malik had shown that people are not defined by where they come from, but by the choices they make. And now, his community, his world, was beginning to understand that too. His story became proof that even the smallest voice can shatter the loudest assumptions. And as Malik walked through his neighborhood, head held high, he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. Malik's story is more than just an account of a heroic act. It is a testament to the power of kindness, courage, and the ability to break down barriers with a single, selfless decision. He didn't have wealth or influence. He wasn't someone the world expected to make a difference. Yet in one defining moment, he proved that true heroism has nothing to do with where you come from, and everything to do with what is in your heart. He had no obligation to help. He could have ignored the cries, continued with his day, and let someone else take responsibility. But that wasn't who Malik was. When he saw danger, he ran toward it, not away from it. When he saw someone in need, he acted. And in doing so, he not only saved a life, but changed the way people saw him, and, more importantly, the way they saw themselves. His actions forced Claire to confront her own biases, to see beyond the assumptions she had carried for so long. She had always thought of herself as a good person, someone who treated others fairly. But when faced with the truth of her own words, she realized the unconscious prejudices she had been blind to. Malik, with nothing but his calm and dignified response, made her rethink everything she had been conditioned to believe. And that is the true power of a single act of courage. It doesn't just change a single moment, it ripples outward, touching people in ways they never expected. Malik's bravery spread through the community, forcing others to re-examine their own biases. Parents, teachers, and neighbors started asking themselves hard questions. How often had they made assumptions without realizing it? How many times had they let their fears or preconceived notions shape the way they treated someone? Slowly, mindsets began to shift. Conversations that had never happened before were now taking place. Children were being taught to see beyond appearances, to judge people based on their character, not their circumstances. It was a small change, but it was real. And that change started with Malik. But despite everything, the recognition, the respect, the newfound awareness, Malik remained the same. He never saw himself as a hero. To him, helping someone in need was not something extraordinary. It was simply the right thing to do. That was what made his story so powerful. He didn't save the baby because he wanted praise. He didn't accept Claire's apology because he needed validation. He did what he did because he believed in kindness, even in a world that wasn't always kind to him. And in doing so, he proved something that too many people had forgotten. Compassion and courage are what truly define us. Malik's story is a reminder to us all. Never underestimate the power of a single courageous act. It doesn't take wealth, privilege, or status to make a difference. It takes heart. It takes a willingness to do what is right, even when no one is watching. It takes the belief that a single moment of kindness can ripple out and change more than just one life. It can change an entire world.